Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to invite you to the PRIO Annual Peace Address for 2011 with Congressman John Lewis as the guest of honor. My name is Christian Berg Harpviken. I am the director of PRIO, and I will have the privilege to take you through today's event. With the Annual Peace Address, PRIO offers a gift to itself, and I hope also to its friends and supporters, inviting every year a guest that can inspire us all, that can renew the agenda of peace research, and that can also inform public debate on issues of peace and conflict. Congressman John Lewis is an ideal guest for our annual address with his long-standing history of promoting non-violence. The title of his talk, The Role of Nonviolence in the Struggle for Liberation, could not be a better fit. At PRIO, we have wanted to bring Congressman Lewis here for over a decade, and it is in many ways a historical irony that it is now, in 2011, when nonviolence has again become the talk of the town, not the least in cities like Tunis, Cairo, and Damascus, that we have proved successful in bringing the congressman here. Congressman Lewis, you were last in Oslo and Norway some 45 years ago, when PRIO's Nils Petter Gleditsch hosted you, then in the capacity of as a president of Oslo's Student Association. At that time you stood in a different struggle, but you're certainly standing in the midst of a struggle also today, and it's so good to have you back. Nonviolence has always been a central theme of peace research, but for much of the past 20 years it has not been a very fashionable topic. Not in the public debate, not to the policy community, and I'm afraid to say, not even to the peace research community. It therefore raised a few eyebrows when PRIO a couple of years ago defined nonviolence, as a key strategic research area with a commitment to renew the nonviolence research agenda and to expand it to new areas, such as the role of nonviolent means in international interventions. Recent experience from Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrates how it is that violence begets violence, and there is certainly a need to document the alternative modes of intervention that are out there. Established in 1959, PRIO takes pride in being one of the world's oldest institutions of peace research. More importantly, we also aim to be one of the best, to be asking the right questions, to be providing the best analysis, to be pushing ahead on the methodologies for researching issues of peace and conflict. We are proud to own and host two world-class academic journals, the Journal of Peace Research and Security Dialogue. We are engaged in a continuous dialogue with policymakers, and we certainly engage in the international public debate. It is exactly at this interface between the highest scholarly standards, the tall ambitions of being relevant, and the commitment to an informed public debate that PRIO is situated. Ultimately, PRIO's research should contribute to a future where peace is the norm and violence is the exception. And I know that this is a vision that is deeply shared by Congressman Lewis. We look very much forward to hear you speak here today. Yesterday, you were interviewed on the Norwegian Broadcasting Company's program Urix. Your concerns, which you expressed there, were very much about the present. They were very much about the political reality which you are part of, and you expressed those concerns very clearly. You said, amongst other things, racism is still embedded in every corner of American society. We are not there yet, you said. We have not created yet what Dr. King, you're referring to your former close colleague, what Dr. King called a beloved society, an open society. Your integrity, having been part of the US civil rights movement in the 1960s, having remained faithful to your commitment to nonviolence for half a century, and your interest in the challenges of the present is nothing but impressive. And I know that we all have something to look forward to. Congressman John Lewis has been serving in Congress since 1987. Long before then, he was a prominent leader of the civil rights movement. He was chairing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. During the March on Washington in 1963, he was the youngest keynote speaker, and he is the only one of the speakers who is currently alive. In Congress, Lewis has voted in opposition to both Iraqi wars, and not the least has he worked relentlessly for the cause of the underprivileged. President Obama has referred to Congressman Lewis as one of his main inspirators. And recently, the congressman was invited to the White House, where he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It certainly is a great pleasure, Congressman Lewis, to invite you back to Oslo and Norway, 45 years after your first visit. It certainly is a great honor to invite you to PRIO. Congressman Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm deeply honored and very delighted to be here today at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. I want to thank you, Director Krishna Hopping, for inviting me here today, and Professor Neil Gletcher for his tireless effort to ensure that this journey will come to pass. Mr. Ambassador and Mrs. White, thank you for being here. To each and every one of you, my beloved brothers and sisters, it is good to be here in Norway, here in Oslo, one more time. I remember coming here a few short years ago when I was much younger. I had all of my hair and a few pounds lighter. And now I find myself here at this prestigious institution, at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, where you study the work of peace. You verify the work of nonviolence, and you quantify the approaches that help create peace in our world. You have contributed so much to the growing body of research that confirm the power and potential for peace to heal the conflict, the schism, the division of our time. You know so much about resolving conflict between nations and people, between groups. You know how people can live together, people in our society, people in different communities, different parts of the world. And you have ideas about how to implement the way of peace as public policy. With this profound knowledge and understanding you have stored all in the minds and in this room, it leads me to ask myself that you know so much, you're so smart, you're so brilliant. So I must ask myself, as someone who grew up in rural Alabama in the heart of the American South on a farm, you're scholars, yes, you're great researchers, but what do you know about raising chickens? Oh, now some of you heard the chicken story since I've been here, and some of you probably heard it in 1966. I grew up on a farm in rural Alabama, about 50 miles from Montgomery. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. But back in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4, I really do. How many of you remember when you were 4? That's very good, but what happened to the rest of us? Well, in 1944, when I was only 4 years old, my father had saved $300, and with the $300, he bought 110 acres of land. And on this farm, we raised a lot of cows and hogs. We raised a lot of cotton and corn and peanuts. We raised a lot of chickens. It was my responsibility to care for the chickens. And I fell in love with raising chickens like no one else could raise chicken. How many of you here in Oslo, here in Norway, know anything about raising chickens? Okay, let's have a little fun here. Well, as a little boy, I would take the fresh eggs when the hen was set, mark the fresh egg with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, and wait for 3 long weeks for the little chicks to hatch. Some of you smart scholars and researchers, lawyers, physicians, writers, you may be asking the question, now John Lewis, why would you mark those fresh eggs with a pencil before you place them under the setting hen? Well, from time to time, another hen would get on that same nest, and there would be some more eggs. And you had to be able to tell the fresh eggs from the eggs that were already under the setting hen. Do you follow me? You don't follow me, it's okay. When the little chick would hatch, I would fool these setting hens. I would cheat on these setting hens. I would take these little chicks and give them to another hen. I'll put them in a box with a lantern, raise them on their own, get some more fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, encourage the setting hen. They're still in the nest for another 3 weeks. I kept on fooling and cheating on these setting hens. And when I look back on it, it was not the right thing to do. It was not the moral thing to do. It was not the democratic thing to do. It was not the most loving thing to do. It was not the most peaceful or nonviolent thing to do, but I kept on cheating on these setting hens. Now in America, we have a large department store, an order housing store called Citizen Roebuck, and you can order everything. And we used to order incubator and hatchet from the Citizen Roebuck store. We didn't do it because we never had enough money. So we would get the catalog, and we called this catalog the wish book. I wish I had this. I wish I had that. So I just kept on cheating on these setting hens. But as a young child growing up in rural Alabama, I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach the gospel. So from time to time, with the help of my brothers and sisters and my first cousins, we would gather all of our chickens together in the chicken yard, like you would gather here in this hall. My brothers and sisters and cousins were lined the outside and around the chicken yard, but they all made up the congregation, the audience. And I would start speaking or preaching, and when I look back on it, the chickens that I preached to during the 40s and the 50s, some of those chickens tended to bow their heads, shake their heads. They never quite said amen. But I'm convinced that some of those chickens that I preached to during the 40s and the 50s tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listen to me today in the Congress. As a matter of fact, some of those chickens were just a little more productive. At least they produce eggs. So I must tell you, I'm not trying to accuse any of you of being chicken. But I must tell you that I'm so grateful to be here today, because when I meet you, I'm connected with partners I've never seen in an ongoing struggle that will continue long after we all are gone. I want to thank you for the music. Music is so powerful. in the struggle for peace, in the struggle for beloved community, in the struggle for beloved world. And there are three simple words that capture everything I will say to you today. The struggle continues. As you chart the course of peace movements around the world and study the ups and the downs, the highs and the lows, the wavelength or human dedication to the work of peace, you may see your work day to day as the work of research, as that development of a scientific record, or the power of peace. I go to work day to day in a different society, in another part of the world, in a different time zone, 6 hours behind yours. I'm a congressman, simple congressperson from Georgia, a player in the rough and tumble world or game of politics. While you're researching, I'm voting. While you're writing, I'm on the floor, maybe speaking or somewhere else. While you're delivering a paper, I may be meeting with people from the city of Atlanta, from the state of Georgia, or from all over America. But even though we live in different places at different times, in different societies, we are both engaged in one struggle, the same struggle. And that struggle is not with Republicans or with my fellow Democrats, with President Obama or the Tea Party. Your struggle is not with the military, scientists, or proponents of war in Iraq or Afghanistan or any part of the Middle East. You and I, we together, have a mission and a mandate that is focused, is not science or politics, it is target is the human soul. The target is the human spirit. We are engaged in an ongoing struggle between the forces of light and the instruments of darkness, finally meant to silence the inner conflict within the minds that give rise to every battle, every wound, and every difficulty we face in the world today. You asked me, you pleaded with me, you urged me, you told me to respond to a question. What is the role of nonviolence in the struggle for liberation? But in truth, this question has already been answered by men and women much greater than I. Gandhi put it this way. He said, it is either nonviolence or non-existent. Martin Luther King Jr. put it another way. He said we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish as fools. He went on to say, there is no way to peace. Peace is the way. Adherence to the path and the principle of nonviolence is liberation. Peace. Liberate our minds, our souls, and our heart. The first time I got arrested, involved in a peaceful, nonviolent protest, I felt free. I felt liberated. Our challenge is not to discover the truth, because our messengers have already come. They have told us what is true and even showed us with their lives. Their sacrifice, given all they had to bear witness to the truth. Our struggle is not find the truth, but to believe the truth. It is not to find the truth, but to believe the truth. When we discover the truth, we believe it. We accept it. We live it. Peace is the truth. The way of nonviolence is the truth. Nonviolence is one of those immutable principles that we cannot deviate from or turn our back on. And once we have first convinced ourselves, then our struggle is to persuade the rest of the human family who have their own minds, their own wills, their own destiny. We must show them that nonviolence is a more excellent way. The way of peace is a more excellent way. It is the good way. It is a better way. It was December the 10th, 1964, that Martin Luther King Jr. walked the streets of Oslo and accepted the Nobel Prize for Peace. It was 46 years ago when he said civilization and violence are the antithesis of each other's. He said sooner or later, all the people of the world will have to discover a way to live together in peace and thereby transform this pending cosmic elegy into a created sons of brotherhood. If this is to be achieved, he said, we must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a message is love. Is it possible? Is it possible for humankind to lay down the burden of war, the burden of conflict, and move toward a different way, a better way? Dr. King said, the foundation of such a way, of such a method, is love. You and I, my beloved friends, in a struggle, and that struggle for peace is as old as the dawn of history and as young as the morning dew or the morning newspaper. The seed that was planted in India and the winds of change that have been blowing across the ocean to be transplanted in the hearts and minds of ordinary people with an extraordinary vision in the United States. We were not the most learned. We were not the elite. We didn't have millions and billions of dollars. We were not the people hoped for or saw as blessed. We were those people hoped would disappear. We were those they tried to will into non-existent by denying us every civil rights and every human right. Many of us never had an opportunity to travel, to get an education. Many of our foreparents never finished grade school or high school, attended the fine colleges or universities just a few miles away from our hometown. It was a distant dream to get an education, to travel. We were the ordinary people with extraordinary vision who got caught up in the ideas exposed by men and women of the highest learning and spiritual power. It was the maids, the butlers, the toilers, the workers in the fields who heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr., which we study today, who were deeply inspired by the teaching of Gandhi and the teaching of the great teacher. We followed the precepts of nonviolence developed by Gandhi. They saw the message of a president of Harvard University by the name of Mordecai Johnson in Washington, D.C. the teaching of Howard Thurman. Most of us did not have a PhD degree. Sometimes our subjects and verbs did not agree, but we heard the truth that was written on our hearts. We saw it as a way out. We saw it as a road to our liberation. We decided to get involved in a struggle that would demonstrate nonviolence as a better way. We didn't have much money or power or position, but we had ourselves, we had our bodies. And we were inspired literally to put our bodies on the line in a nonviolent way, in a peaceful and creative way. We put our bodies on the line for the cause of civil rights and social justice. You heard me say earlier that I grew up on a farm in rural Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery. My parents were sharecroppers. Sharecropping was part of a mean or cruel system of oppression, painful akin to the bondage of slavery that took over the South after President Lincoln emancipated the slave at the end of the Civil War. As a young child growing up in Alabama, in the heart of the American South, I tasted the bitter fruits of racism, and I didn't like it. I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women. I saw those signs that said white waiting, colored waiting. I used to ask my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents, why segregation, why racial discrimination? And they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way. Don't get in trouble. But one day, when I was only 15 years old, in the 10th grade, I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. He was talking about the ability of a committed, determined people to make a difference in our society. When I heard his voice, I felt like he was saying directly to me, John Lewis, you too can make a contribution. He was saying to me, you can strike a blow against segregation and racial discrimination through the use of nonviolence. You can help bring down the walls. You can help tear down the barriers. And I found a way to get in the way, and I decided to get in the way. I decided to get in trouble. It was good trouble. It was necessary trouble. So I come here to say for more than 50 years, I've been getting in trouble. At the age of 23, I was the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Yes, I spoke at the March on Washington, along with Dr. King and 8 others. I traveled around my country, encouraging young people to come south, committed to the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence, committed to building the beloved community, committed to ending segregation and racial discrimination, committed to help people become registered voters. They came to Mississippi. They got involved with the Freedom Summer of 1964. Back in 1964, in America, in the American South, the 11 states of the old Confederacy, it was almost impossible for people of color to register to vote. In 1964, the state of Mississippi had a black voting age population of more than 450,000, and only about 18,000 blacks were registered to vote. In one political subdivision in my native state of Alabama, Lowndes County, 80% of the population African American, but there was not a single registered African American voter. People were beaten, people were jailed, some people were shot and killed. We were young people, we had a dream, we began organizing with one simple mission: to register as many people as possible. It was a great task. We had passion. We didn't have a website. We hadn't heard of the internet. We didn't have an iPad. We didn't have a cellular telephone. We didn't have a fax machine. But we used what we had to bring about a nonviolent revolution, a revolution of values, a revolution of ideas. In 1964, the state of Mississippi, the state of Alabama, were dangerous places to work. And freedom and liberation did not come without a heavy cause. Less than a month after we arrived in Mississippi, 3 young civil rights workers, 3 young men that I knew, Andy Goodman, Mickey Schreiner, both white, both Jewish, and James Chaney, a young black man, disappeared. Later we found out that these 3 young men had been arrested, been detained, and taken to jail. That same night they were released from jail by the sheriff and turned over to the Klan. They were beaten, shot, and murdered. I tell this story so you would know that the struggle for justice has not been straight. It has not been easy. It's been a long, hard road littered by the battered and broken bodies of countless men and women who paid the ultimate price for a precious right, the right to participate in the democratic process. People who use nonviolence, not simply as a means, not simply as a tactic, not simply as a technique, but who accepted nonviolence as a way of life, as a way of living. Just 47 years ago, another generation had the courage, had the capacity, had the ability to get in the way. They put aside the comfort of their own lives and they got involved in the circumstances of others. Today, another generation took over the State House in Wisconsin. And right now, sit-ins are going on Wall Street in New York. The pressure for an end to violence and the rule of tyrants, the link to the struggle lingered of King and Gandhi, because it's part of the same movement. Whether it's in the Middle East, in other parts of Africa, or in America or Asia, Central or South America, our struggle is one of the same. People must be free. They must be liberated. And the best way to do it is the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence. It is part of the same movement to involve from all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation, as Dr. King said right here in 1964, right here in Oslo. Day to day, I struggle with my colleagues in the Congress, with people in my own district, and throughout our country, to find the way toward peace in our policy and struggle with myself to determine what is right in a sea of unsavory option within the political process at the moment. You struggle in the lecture hall. You struggle in the library. You struggle as you do your research and in front of blank pages, traveling to war-torn areas documenting the workers' change and debating the meaning of your founding with your colleagues. But in many ways, we all are holding our place. We all are searching. Is it possible for human beings to evolve at that level where we can lay down the tools and instrument of violence and war? Is it possible for us to live at peace with ourselves? I want to thank you for holding the lamp and holding the lamp high, the lamp of peace, shining your light in every quarter of our lives and struggling within all of us, ourselves, to live by the concepts we seek to share with others. We're like trees planted by the rivers of waters, whose roots grow and extend along the banks. And when the storms rage and the river overflow, our roots have the power to hold the soil in place. What you're doing, you keep the riverbanks from eroding altogether, from wearing away until there's nothing left. There would be setbacks. There would be disappointments. But you cannot go back. The way to peace is the way to go. There will be problems. That is how I would describe the terror you experienced here in this great country in July. Some dead, many wounded, innocent little children at a summer camp. Terrors rise by the ranting and raving of a madman, a professed Christian, a proponent of the extreme right wing, a man who left bomb to explode right here in the fair and peaceful city of Oslo, in a nation dedicated to peace. You may ask the question, why? And the question of how and why and what must be asked, and not necessarily who. Violence is never welcome on the pathway to peace. I've been a victim of violence, beaten, left bloody and unconscious. Had a concussion on the bridge to Selma. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. But through it all, I committed myself to the work and the ongoing struggle for peace. And as we know, and as you know so well, as sojourners on this road, it is our work to decipher its meaning and to discover the way of peace in the most horrifying circumstances. In the tradition of Martin Luther King, there is a saying that I would like to alter a little here. We say all things can work together for good to those who love peace and are called according to his service. This is not to say that the work of violence is good. No, it is wrong. It is wrong to war, wrong to kill, wrong to spill the blood of innocent men, women, and children. Wrong to terrorize a peaceful community, a peaceful city. But when it rears its ugly head, it demonstrates the distance we have come and the progress we must continue to make. It also demonstrates the work still left to be done if we had believed that the end of World War II would silence those, if we believe that our commitment to peace in the ivory towers of the university has encouraged the progress of humankind, these outbursts can serve us by demonstrating that there are profound elements and remnants of aggression still left in our society and in our world, that we still must be on guard. We must carry the message of peace, the message of love, the message of nonviolence. We have an obligation, a mandate, and a moral obligation to do what we can. Some of you may recall that during the last presidential election, just before the end of that campaign in 2008, I warned against the language of hate that sows seeds of destruction. So it was no incident that we experienced violence, racial epithets, and even the wounding of a member of Congress a few months ago. Hostility, division can wear the roles of extremism, of religious hatred, self-righteous, political parties, or justified wars. It can hide behind the law like it did in the murder of Troy Anthony Davis by the state of Georgia, or be wrapped in national pride like the rush to war in Iraq or Afghanistan. But hidden aggression will have its there. There's no way to hide, no way to cover up, to justify, to rationalize, to order the fact that we adopt the way of peace and reject the seduction of violence. If we move down that road, we will reap a bitter harvest of destruction in our lives and in our world. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way. I've said many times on the House floor in my own Congress, in my own country. I've said on the floor of the House of Representatives that war is bloody. War is messy. It's here not only to hide the truth, but to sacrifice the truth. And every war we have engaged in as a people had ended in the same way with thousands, even millions of casualties. Thousands of acres of land left barren and scarred. History is lost. Lives are torn apart. Men, women, and children sacrificed for too little gain. These are not good stories. These are not the stories of America or Norway that we want to tell, but they are the stories of the time we live in. They demonstrate the distance we have come, progress we have made in the struggle, and the progress we still must make. In the civil rights movement, we used to say, our struggle is not a struggle for one day, 1 week, 1 month, or 1 year. Our struggle is not the struggle of a lifetime. It may be a struggle of many lifetimes. And each of us, in our own sector of our world, in our own profession, and in our own life, must do our part to build what we call the beloved community. Consider those two words. Beloved community. Beloved means not hateful, not violent, not uncaring, not unkind. And community means not separated, not polarized, not locked in struggle. The most pressing challenge in our society today is how we defend the dignity of humankind. Now, I would like to end this little talk with a story from my childhood that I think symbolizes the commitment we must make to the work of human evolution. to the work for peace, to the struggle for peace. Through our own inner revolution, to move our minds, our hearts, and ultimately our world, step by step, away from weapons of inner conflict, hatred against each other, to our demonstrated commitment to the principle we espouse, we can build a society and a world community based on simple justice that respect the dignity and the worth of every individual. And build what I like to call, and what Dr. King called, the beloved community, or a beloved world. When I was growing up outside of Troy, Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, I had an aunt by the name of Seneva. And my Aunt Seneva lived in what we call a shotgun house. I know here in Norway, here in Oslo, you don't know what I'm talking about. You never seen a shotgun house. I was born in a shotgun house. My Aunt Seneva didn't have a manicured lawn. Had a simple plain dirt yard. And sometime at night, you can look up through the holes in the ceiling, through the holes in the tin roof, and count the stars. When it would rain, she would get a pail, a bucket, a tub, and catch the rainwater. From time to time, she would walk out into the woods and cut limbs, branches from a dogwood tree and make a broom, and she called that broom the breast broom. And she would sweep this dirt yard very clean, sometimes 2 and 3 times a week, but especially on a Friday or Saturday, because she wanted that dirt yard to look good during the weekend. For those of you who've grown up in Norway, live in Oslo, you never seen a shotgun house. In a nonviolent sense, a shotgun house, old house, one way in, one way out, where you can bounce a basketball through the front door, and it will go straight out the back door. My Aunt Seneva lived in a shotgun house. One Saturday afternoon, a group of my brothers and sisters and a few of my first cousins, about 15 of us young children, were playing in her front yard. And an unbelievable storm came up. The wind started blowing, the thunder started rolling, the lightning started flashing, and the rain started beating on the tin roof of this old shotgun house. My aunt became terrified. She started crying. She thought the old house was going to blow away. She got all of us, the children, together and told us to hold hands. And we did as we were told. The wind continued to blow. The lightning continued to flash. The thunder continued to roll. And the rain continued to beat down on the tin roof of this old shotgun house. My aunt cried and cried, and we cried and cried. And when one corner of this old house appeared to be lifting from its foundation, my aunt had us to walk to that corner to try to hold the house down with our little bodies. When the other side appeared to be lifted, she had us to walk to that side to try to hold the house down with our little bodies. We were little children walking with the wind, but we never left the house. I said to you, Peace Research Institute, Oslo, the wind may blow, the thunder may roll, the lightning may flash, and the rain may beat down on our old house, but you must never ever leave the house. The rain may beat down on this old house we call Oslo, call it the house of Norway, call it the house of England or France, call it the American house, call it the world house. We all live in the same house. We must never ever leave that house. We must not give up. We must not give in. We must not give out in our struggle for peace and nonviolence in our struggle to liberate humankind. During the last half of the century, we have come a great distance. We have witnessed a nonviolent revolution under the rule of law, a revolution of values, a revolution of ideas, led by Martin Luther King Jr., inspired by Gandhi, but we still have a distance to go. I said to you as great scholars, great teachers, great writers, unbelievable thinkers of this great institution, you still have the power to lead. Study, do your research. You have the power to change the social, economic, political structures around you. You must say to the people, not just of Norway, but the people of the world, we must build and not tear down. We must bring together and not divide. We must heal and not kill. We must love and not hate. Honor and truth and unconditional love will have the final say in our world. That is why temporary defeat is stronger than evil triumphing. You still have the power to lead and inspire a nonviolent revolution. You use that power with research. If you continue to pursue a standard of excellence in your research, in your daily life, in a new and better world, a beloved community, a beloved world, is yours for the asking. It's yours for the building. So I said to you, walk with the wind. Walk with the spirit of history. And let the way of nonviolence, the way of peace, the way of love be your guide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You show humility, you show commitment, and it's exactly that combination of commitment and humility that we will all strive for. You certainly place high ideals in front of us, so we know what to strive for. Thank you, Congressman Lewis. We have invited two people to comment on Congressman Lewis's speech. And having just listened to it, you will understand why we haven't asked anybody that will operate within the same genre as Congressman Lewis does. That would be most unfair, not to Congressman Lewis, but to the commentators in question. So we have asked two scholars. And talking about scholars, Congressman, I am probably the only peace researcher in this room, at least, to know how to breed chicken. I do actually still own a chicken house. I'm not running it myself, I have to admit, but nonetheless. The first scholar that will be commenting on your contribution is Kathleen Cunningham. To me, Kathleen is first and foremost PRIOite, an integral part of the PRIO research milieu. She spent a year at PRIO from 2009 to 2010 as a research associate within PRIO's Center for the Study of Civil War. She is also a member of our own journal, the Journal of Peace Research, a member of the editorial committee. And she is most relevant in this context at the forefront of a new research initiative we have taken, in which we will be looking not only at the norms of nonviolence, but in fact at the very effectiveness of nonviolence. This project will be taking political organizations who are in disagreement with their own governments as its point of departure, and we'll be looking at the choices that political movements make in terms of using the instruments of violence, a term you use, Congressman, or in this case, what we would describe as the instruments of nonviolence, to see where success comes. I'm sure you shall learn more about this from Kathleen. She's more of an expert on this than I am, and I look very much to hear what Kathleen has to say. Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here at PRIO, to join you and to just have the honor to talk about nonviolence with such a significant practitioner and inspiration for those who study nonviolence and for those who adhere to the norms of nonviolence today. It's an honor to be here. What I hope to add with my own comments is as Christian mentioned, a synthesis of the scholarship on nonviolence with the realities of nonviolent struggles today, and to explore the pressing policy questions that have emerged from the study of nonviolence and its application in real-world challenges that we see today in the Middle East and in North Africa, and that continue throughout the world, here in Norway and the United States as well. Let me begin by highlighting the phenomenal changes we've seen in the past months in North Africa and the Middle East, and the role that violence and nonviolence has played in those struggles. As you all know, in the past 10 months, we've seen social revolutions in Tunisia and in Egypt, a civil war in Libya, uprisings in Bahrain, Syria, and Yemen, and protests breaking out in a number of other countries. Many of these struggles have relied on nonviolent tactics, and these people pressed their demands for radical social change using nonviolence, refusing to resort to armed conflict. Yet in other cases, we see the outbreak of violence between protesters and the government forces, and sometimes between protesters and civilians that support the government and reject nonviolence. Yet in other cases, we see large-scale use of violence, a turn to full-blown conflict. These movements, both violent and nonviolent, have led to concessions from these governments. They've led to 3 regime changes, but they have also led to conflict and to repression. These events were both riveting and in some ways shocking. Few would have predicted the change that we see in North Africa and the Middle East, nor the means through which it occurred, this use of nonviolence and its success. The possibility of radical social change brought about in the Middle East through nonviolence was not something that others could predict, both scholars and practitioners prior to the mass protests in Tunisia. These events, in particular the stark comparison of the social change achieved in Tunisia and in Egypt through peaceful means, but in Libya through violent upheaval, have recalled the necessity of understanding when civil resistance can work, and why protesters turn to violence in some cases and not in others. Historically, much of the scholarship on nonviolence has been instructive, descriptive, or normative. The work of Gene Sharp, for example, has served as a practical guide for resistance movements around the world and has been used in numerous struggles to overturn dictators. Sharp and those that followed him help us to understand what it means to apply pressure on governments without resorting to violence, and the ways in this can be achieved through sit-ins to mass protests. Other works provide inspiration to adherents of nonviolence through descriptive narratives of campaigns around the world, from Russia to the United States to India and beyond. Critical lessons from the American Civil Rights Movement and other successful campaigns have illustrated the power of nonviolence to achieve social change. Many of these studies have emphasized the goal of delegitimizing one's opponent or restricting an adversary's ability to use power against them. Work on regime change in El Salvador and South Africa, for example, focus on the ability of civil resistance to impose costs on government. This ability is often connected with strategic choice, the use of violence or nonviolence in different contexts. But it's also connected to mass mobilization, getting people on board to engage in nonviolent activities. Quite recently, there's been a shift in the study of nonviolence that moves toward understanding the efficacy of nonviolent strategies, that is, how and why civil resistance works. One study compares successful and failed movements, campaigns of nonviolence, shows that tactical innovation is a key in successful nonviolent campaigns. And indeed, we see the use of social media, such as Twitter, to be presumed to play a major role in successful nonviolent campaigns in the Middle East in recent months. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stepin's recent book, Why Civil Resistance Works, compares violent and nonviolent campaigns. They argue that nonviolence can draw more participants than violence, and in doing so has an advantage over the use of violence. Nonviolence can create a stable base of supporters willing to impose costs on states. Strikingly, Chenoweth and Stepin find that nonviolent campaigns are twice as likely to work as violent campaigns to achieve social change. This runs counter to many people's perceptions that resorting to violence is the more effective way to impose costs on a state, the more effective way to gain attention from your government. The recent scholarship on the success of nonviolence has highlighted an important gap in our understanding of the efficacy of nonviolence in different contexts. The social revolutions in the Middle East have brought this to the forefront. Many of those movements had peaceful roots, but only some survived as nonviolent campaigns. Several questions emerge from this recalling to understanding the efficacy of nonviolence. And I'd like to highlight 3 of those for you today, and to link these to international politics. This is an International Peace Research Institute, and want to connect this scholarship to actual policy questions, become more and more relevant over time. First, the relative success of nonviolent campaigns appears to be limited to some degree to pro-democracy movements. And these are the kinds of movements we've seen achieving success in the Middle East. Research shows that nonviolent campaigns are much less successful when focused on issues of territorial control or secession, and I'll admit this is my own area of expertise, so I tend to think these issues are important. Few groups are able to secede in the modern state system. We've seen some recent success, which I'll mention in a few moments, in Sudan. The groups that do secede almost universally resort to violence. This is the dominant strategy through which they can achieve political concessions from their states, and it is coming to be seen as the only way to achieve successful secession. This is troubling in part because war over self-determination, over national secession, has become the most common kind of conflict in the international system in the last 40 years. Cases such as Chechnya and the Tamils in Sri Lanka exemplify these disputes. There's also a great deal of potential future conflict over this issue. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been a steady increase in the number of minorities claiming rights to self-determination. This is a problem unlikely to be resolved. Thus, we have some reasons to believe that nonviolence works, but not particularly well for one of the most pressing international problems today. Why is this the case? And how can that be changed is a critical question for the future, and in particular for future scholarship. A second question that emerges from the evaluation of whether and how nonviolence works relates to the necessity of mass participation. Scholars and practitioners alike highlight the importance of mobilizing people in large numbers. Yet we know little about the conditions under which this is likely to happen. The success of nonviolent campaigns hinges on achieving a high number of participants, and this can create substantial problems of collective action. Moreover, as we had illustrated here for us today, civil resistance movements are often met with violent repression, and this creates strong disincentives for individual participation. How do some campaigns overcome this? The ability to generate mass mobilization is likely to be influenced by a number of factors, such as the nature of the movement, whether it's regime change, pro-democracy, or secession, the resources available to supporters, and support from outside actors, such as kin living across borders, and in particular, the international community, can play a critical role in mobilization to nonviolence. Moreover, many successful campaigns for social change are inspired by truly charismatic leaders, such as Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and Gandhi, and sustained by continual acts of courage and commitment by leaders such as Congressman Lewis from my own country. Our understanding of how and why different factors contribute to the success of nonviolent resistance remains limited, despite the wealth of practical and normative research on this topic. This question should be the focus of sustained research, much in the way that we have endeavored to understand the outbreak and consequences of violent campaigns and of social violence around the world. Finally, I would argue that we need to integrate our understanding of civil war and of social violence with an understanding of nonviolence. Studies that evaluate the effectiveness of nonviolence have largely been comparisons of their success and failure, and more recently, whether violent or nonviolent campaigns are more effective. What is missing from the existing approach is that nearly all movements for political change involve some elements of moderation and some of radicalization. Let us return to the example of struggles for national self-determination. Even among the most conventional political struggles, such as the Jura movement in Switzerland, there were elements of strategic violence, people that were willing to use bombs to get their point across to the government. Moreover, disputes rife with violent conflict, such as the Chechen movement, contain organizations that forge ahead to seek political change by eschewing violence. Indeed, many social movements appear to be engaging in both violent and nonviolent resistance in their efforts to seek political change. At times, organizations within these movements change strategies, transitioning from freedom fighters to activists and vice versa. If organizations seeking political change are making strategic choices about whether to use violence or nonviolence, we need a better understanding of when and why those choices for a particular strategy are made, and why individuals choose to participate in one way or another. Part of the answer is likely to be related to what others are doing, especially since nonviolence requires mass participation to be successful. But there are likely other factors that influence strategic choices of these organizations, and these are likely to change over the trajectory of their campaigns. Thus, understanding incentives for the use of both violence and nonviolence, both at the early and later stages of social upheaval, are important. These questions and the answers we hope to find have important implications for real-world policy choices. Recent events have shown us that the international community can play a critical role in determining the success of civil resistance, but it is not necessarily a straightforward role. If we return to the issue of secession, we can see clearly how the international community is both empowered and critically limited. Secession is nearly impossible without international support. The referendum on independence in southern Sudan highlighted the power of people to choose their own political future, but this ability was predicated on international support. Many groups that aspire to statehood hold these referenda, with essentially no consequences. So it is not just a question of voicing what they want, of using democratic process, but of securing the support of the international community. Yet the international community cannot universally support secession. States want to retain territorial integrity, minority groups want to exercise a right to self-determination. How the international community responds to this tension is important. And historically, it's been nearly schizophrenic. The international community has responded in a variety of different ways with no discernible pattern based on legitimacy of claims over self-determination or even strategic interests. But this response creates incentives for separatists to use particular strategies, and this can make violence or nonviolence more or less attractive as a way to pursue social change. We can see the same dynamic illustrated in the response of the international community to the Arab Spring. There was explicit support given to the armed overthrow of Gaddafi. Yet we fail to see large-scale intervention in cases of nonviolent resistance. This contrast may very well create incentives for the use of violence for other aspirants to political change. These are but a few examples from which it would be quite difficult to discern a pattern of influence, and even more difficult to create coherent policy, although that is the task that governments are charged with. We need greater attention to what kind of incentives the international community can create for agents of social change. Thus, there's a critical challenge for scholars and policymakers alike. If we want to promote the use of nonviolence, we need to sponsor and engage in sustained research on it, as much of the ongoing research here at PRIO endeavors to do. We need to explore the conditions under which it is likely to work and reach towards an understanding of what actions the international community can take to make nonviolence more effective and consequently more attractive to people earnestly seeking social change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. That was a most useful tour de force of the field of nonviolence. Also helps us get wiser. And it struck me as I listened to the final comments that you made that the PRIO Annual Peace Address we had last year by Jon Elster, which was about transitional justice, was very much about the dilemmas of disincentivizing the use of violence in the form of the reactions that the international community takes. We have one more commentator. The next commentator is Henrik Syse. Henrik is a senior researcher at PRIO. He is also, interestingly in this context, the chief editor of the Journal of Military Ethics. He's an associate professor at the Norwegian Defence University College. Henrik has an interesting career. He has, amongst other things, been the head of corporate governance at Norwegian Banks in an international investment fund. He's been leading their work on integrating ethics into the investments of the government's pension fund. His research, however, focuses mainly on moral philosophy, political philosophy, and not the least, the ethics of warfare. As an expert on the ethics of war, Henrik is very well placed to cast light upon the presentation that Congressman Lewis gave us earlier today, and not the least to cast light also upon Congressman Lewis's long life commitment to nonviolence. Henrik, please.
Thank you, Christian. Congressman, Mr. and Mrs. Ambassador, Nils Petter, wherever you are, thank you for making this possible. There you are. You know that this newspaper clip here from the 30th of April 1966, when you last arranged for John Lewis to come here, I was 11 days old at that time. And you look the same and I don't. Ladies and gentlemen, I have donned my peace tie today. I got this from my father, who was a politician. It's from the late 1980s, and it shows a flag of the Soviet Union and of the United States and a dove. And we are thereby reminded of another great victory for nonviolence, because after all, the Iron Curtain fell without a war. People were liberated after a long struggle in what was really one of the miracles alongside the American civil rights movement of the 20th century. Also, it's a great pleasure to talk on behalf of PRIO. I am very, very proud of my own institute. I should add to your chicken story that to most Norwegians here will know that, but to most Norwegians, when they hear the word PRIO, they don't necessarily know it's the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. They believe it's the Eggs and Poultry Center of Norway. Because the word prior is stamped on all kinds of egg baskets, because that's where they come from. So they ask me, what on earth do they need a philosopher for at the Eggs and Poultry Central? The answer is, of course, that I am there to solve the chicken and egg problem. As I'm sure you know, Congressman, Abraham Lincoln once said that it's hard to lead a cavalry charge if you think you look funny on a horse. It takes belief and faith. It takes self-confidence and persistence to lead a cavalry charge against injustice. And John Lewis has indeed displayed all of those qualities. He has led many charges, and I must say personally, as someone intensely interested in American politics, the civil rights struggle, and the rise of an incredibly strong community of African-American politicians and activists, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Jesse Jackson, from Andrew Yang to Barack Obama, indeed to John Lewis. It is a great honor for me to stand here in the company of such a hero. A man who won't die for something is not fit to live, said Martin Luther King Jr. But should a man or woman also be willing to kill for something. In short, can it ever be right to use violence? On this day committed to non-violence, it is my task to ask that uncomfortable question. Let us imagine three models as we approach this question. First, we have, of course, the total renunciation of violence. This can be instrumental and pragmatic in nature, based on a belief that such a stance is the one that eventually brings the best results for mankind, or the greatest good for the greatest number, to use the utilitarian maxim. It can also be based on a belief in personal virtue, such as the Stoic ideal of tranquility or undisturbedness. In other words, it can be a way of living that one aspires to and wants to inspire in others. Certainly Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. both come to mind, and indeed you yourself, sir, who has repeatedly spoken of nonviolence not as an instrument, but as a way of life. Or it can be what we philosophers call deontological, meaning based on a sense of duty. It's a duty not to kill. Whatever the others do, it is simply a basic maxim that we live by. It can be a duty to God, it can be a duty to other human beings, or both. Indeed, all of these approaches I have here delineated can be religiously based or secular. Whatever their origin, we often call such views pacifist. And the pacifist example stands to everyone as a great witness through history of people who have stood up with great danger to themselves when the other party has used violence. Some of the great examples of the early Christian community, for instance, include those who went into battle armed only with a cross. Then, on the other side of the scale, we have the willingness to use violence. Indeed, a willingness to use violence without being restricted by the moral boundaries of everyday life. This is the view that this is indeed the hallmark of a great man and the only realistic course to a stable, if not peaceful, world. This view, admittedly more often instrumental than based on principle or virtue, can also be grounded, maybe paradoxically, in religious belief, most clearly in the Christian teaching of original sin. Namely, that human beings are such that violence or the threat of violence is needed to maintain stability, preserve power, or prepare for the worst in terms of totalitarianism or terrorist onslaughts. This view, which comes in many shapes and forms, often goes by the name of political realism, that we must somehow set aside what we ordinarily think of as political morality once we enter the international arena. In between the two, we find the view that goes by the name of just war. The view that war is indeed morally deeply problematic, yet must sometimes be employed for the sake of justice. As many of you will know, when President Barack Obama was here accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, that is actually what he talked about. To many, it's a scary, almost an immoral concept, more scary in some ways than pure-blooded political realism, which is after all often careful and measured in its recommendations actually to use force. Indeed, one can ask, cannot a view which holds that war can be just be ripe to be exploited by those wishing to cloak their greed for power behind a moral facade? To others, the concept simply makes no sense. How can something bad be just? Just war? Sounds like wonderful adultery, beautiful murder. How can it be possible? But the many thinkers who have contributed to the idea of just war, including one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s great inspirations and heroes, St. Augustine, insisted that the two can, indeed must, go together. That we can sometimes use violence, not for the sake of preservation of power, but for the sake of justice and in the spirit of love. And so that is the question I am asking today. Within the vista drawn up wonderfully for us today by John Lewis and commented on so expertly by Kathleen, is there any room for justified violence, morally speaking? Or should we eschew violence altogether, either from principle, because of virtue, as a witness, or simply because we believe that will have the best consequences? I am speaking about this as someone who is deeply torn myself, as a former officer in the Norwegian Army. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that, said Dr. King. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that, he added. But can the use of armed force be driven by love, by an unselfish spirit, by a pure concern for the other? Or to pose the question slightly differently and more realistically, even if such pure motivations are unrealistic and hard to come by, can we still imagine a world where we can intervene militarily in Libya, in the Balkans, even in Afghanistan, in a way that conforms to moral principle and does less harm than good? Can we carry your torch of nonviolence and the example of the civil rights movement and nonetheless consistently say that we believe that sometimes we need to intervene with armed force? Let me make this problem even more difficult for you. They say that there are two human beings on this planet who wake up every morning with a tortured conscience, not because they used armed force, but because they did not command the use of armed force. Then Vice Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and then President of the United States of America, Bill Clinton. You, sir, have met them both and know one of them well. Many of us admire both of them for much of what they did and said, but in March and April of 1994, they failed, along with so many others, to fully appreciate the drama that was unfolding in Rwanda, as bands of Hutu militias and civilians gradually started what became one of the worst acts of genocide in modern history. The case is difficult. What if we had sent troops there at that time? What if 30 or 40,000 soldiers from the United States, Norway, and other countries had flowed into Rwanda, and say 1,000 of them had died, of which, say, 30 were Norwegian youngsters, killed brutally with machete knives, and that 50,000, mostly Tutsi civilians, in the end had been massacred, as opposed to the 800,000 we know actually died? Does anyone in this room believe that we would have called it a success? Would we have said that violence turned out to be the solution, and let's do it again? I dare say not. And therein lies the great problem. Even if we believe, as I continue to do, that a willingness to employ armed force can sometimes represent the only solution to protracted conflict, for the sake of intervening on behalf of innocents, and can be carried out in a way that respects those rules that flow from the just war tradition, the use of armed force is always, as you said, sir, messy, deadly, and terribly costly. I say this with a two-pronged intention, both of them related to what you have said today. Firstly, ethically speaking, it seems, arguably, that we are sometimes forced in our world to at least contemplate the use of armed force. But when we do so, we must be honest about its possible consequences, realistic about our allies and who they are, clear about our intentions, and committed, pre-committed to our principles. The United States' involvement in Iraq from 2003, which I know that you strongly opposed in the House of Representatives, seems to have failed on all those counts. But secondly, and more importantly, those of us who would have it that force can sometimes be used for a good purpose must be clear about its last resort character. An old saying insists that if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Or to put it into our context, if the only tool you see as really representing determined action against evil is the use of armed force, then every problem will give you an excuse to use it. How often did we not hear? Just go back on YouTube and Google and listen to what leading American politicians, not from your party, sir, said in 2002, early 2003, in the build-up to Iraq. They said, we cannot stand idly by and do nothing. In other words, what they said was that all alternative ways at maneuvering oneself out of this terribly difficult standoff with Saddam Hussein was nothing. Nonviolence was seen as equivalent to non-action. I think that is one of the great rhetorical challenges of politics, to show that that is not the case. Echoing what both speakers have said, I think our time needs a whole new respect for, and also, as Kathleen said several times, an intensified research interest in nonviolence, even among, or maybe especially among, those of us who are not themselves pacifist. We need not least to learn more from small-scale and regional successes in building peace and see what lessons they carry for other regions, and indeed globally, I think we need a sort of analogical thinking where we, to a larger extent, see what we can actually extract from the successes of the world. We need to invest more time in understanding the possibilities of nonviolence, while at the same time not abandoning the standards, the strict standards. We are in the house of the Red Cross right now, which insists on those standards all the time, that must guide the use of armed force. I see representatives who have been out there with armed force today and know how much those standards mean. There's a kind of schizophrenia here. And this seeming schizophrenia is well illustrated by PRIO, isn't it, Christian? A research institute which has as one of its stated goals to do research on nonviolent transformation of conflict and the building of security by nonviolent means. A research institute that comes out of the nonviolence movement, yet hosts, at least co-hosts among other things, a journal of military ethics and publishes books on the right use of armed force. I believe in that schizophrenia, as long as it is guided by clear principle. It is an institute committed to its founder's vision of a more peaceful world and in opposition to the power of what US President Dwight D. Eisenhower, himself a military man, 50 years ago described as the threat of the military-industrial complex. Yet it also houses people who believe that NATO and other regional alliances dedicated to military defense can play a constructive role in combating violence and building the peace we all seek. The problem is, of course, and I'll end there, that weapons are seemingly always the loudest, drowning out the message of nonviolence and peace. Indeed, as I sat over here in this very building, just a bit more than 2 months ago, my colleagues and I were disturbed, shocked, by the loudest bang I have ever heard, on July 22nd, just a few blocks from here. Yet within a few days of that monstrous thunder, we rose to your call. That sound was overshadowed and made inaudible indeed by flowers, the holding of hands, prayers, and strong words committed to nonviolence. And maybe in the end, that's the best we can do, both as politicians, activists, and as serious researchers, without any ideological policy aim, but with a belief in the power of knowledge and facts. We must stand together and amplify the messages that so easily get drowned out in the din of violence in the everyday world. My father, himself a politician, used to say that the most important messages must be repeated incessantly. And it said, it's when you get tired of saying it yourself that it may start to seep in out there. Therefore, it's fantastic, Congressman Lewis, to hear you here from this podium today with the same sort of strength you had during the March on Washington in 1963. And my father would often quote Benjamin Franklin, echoing what Kathleen said about the importance of mass participation, who famously said, we must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately. Thank you, John Lewis, for your reminders, your strong example, your courage, your willingness to come back to PRIO and to issue challenges to all of us researchers here today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Henrik, for taking the uncomfortable position and for doing it so well. We need that, and I have nothing to add to what you said about PRIO and the schizophrenia that we owe ourselves in the difficult work that we are engaged in. At my workstation this morning, I received a few interesting emails. As the director of PRIO, I inherited the privilege of speculating on who will win the Nobel Peace Prize this year. And yesterday I posted on the web a list of 5 possible recipients. The 3 top candidates on my list are all nonviolent proponents who have been instrumental in the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia. Those, of course, are also pioneers of the social media, so the fact that they immediately get a response should not come as a surprise. I did receive comments from citizens of Egypt and Tunisia, and they were quite interesting in themselves. One person, for example, challenged my view that these were proponents of nonviolence, referring to the great carnage that had been caused by the protests in Cairo and elsewhere. Perhaps not surprisingly, it was quite clear that this was somebody who had been done great harm to and also belonged to the privileged class prior to the protests. Wal Ghunim, an Egyptian activist who figured as number 2 on my list, twittered about the speculations that it was most unfitting to suggest that he, as an individual, should be awarded the prize. If anybody should be awarded the prize, speaking to the mass participation that you've all been referring to in your contributions, it should be the Egyptian people, not an individual such as himself. Congressman Lewis, it's been a great honor to be sitting here in front of you and listen to you, to learn from your experience, to learn from your commitment. And we are certainly inspired. It will inspire our research agenda. I think we already got a gist as to how it will inspire us in the 2 very fruitful commentaries that we had. We would like to honor you with a little gift before we move on from the plenary hall here. And the gift is coming here. This is a print that has been made by the Norwegian artist and illustrator Trond Nordahl on the occasion of PRIO's 50th anniversary. It is a gift that plays with soldiers, but I think as you also get closer to the print and sees the text, you will see that it resonates with many of the things that you expressed yourself here today. So please receive this gift. We will give it to you in a more handy format.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'd also like to offer some flowers to the 2 very able commentators, please.